Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline, Broadcasting Network, twitch.tv/F4W video, F4WOnline.com/YouTube. We are here every Wednesday, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, and we are live today with a very special show. We're going to be joined by Richard B. Spence, the author of a number of books, including Secret Agent 666, Alistair Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. We're going to be talking about Alistair Crowley today, secret societies, and plenty more. Richard B. Spence, he's got a podcast as well. You can check it out on YouTube, Strange As It Seems, at Strange As It Seems Podcast, and a number of different episodes up there. Who are the Illuminati? Who wrote the protocols? Lost Continents, Subterranean Realms, Occult Hitler, and plenty more. That is up there at Strange As It Seems on YouTube. And we're going to be talking to Richard Spence about all sorts of different topics coming up here today. If you would like to send a question for the show, you're welcome to do so. 425-780-7566 is the text message line. Text me there, 425-780-7566. You can also send me an email, brian@afterdarkradioshow.com. And you can follow me on Threads, Instagram, and Cameo, F4W Online. Personalized cameos, just $10. F4W Online on Cameo. I'm also at Bryan Alvarez on X and Blue Sky. All of these ways to contact me available pretty much 24/7. I got a bunch of After Dark emails that we're going to go over in the future. I know a lot of you have sent me stories, have not gone over all of those. You can always send those to brian@afterdarkradioshow.com. Anything that plays in the topics we discuss here on the program. Back in a moment, Richard B. Spence, Secret Agent 666, Alistair Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline, Broadcasting Network. Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern every Wednesday. Very happy today to be joined by Richard B. Spence. He appeared in various documentaries, History Channel consultant for the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., has written a number of books, including Special Agent 666, Alistair Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. Richard, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I was very excited to be talking about Alistair Crowley today, but before the show, I was looking at your YouTube page. You've got a podcast. Strange as It Seems is the podcast. And, man, I took a look at some of these episodes, and we could go years, I think, talking different topics. But let's get a quick plug out first. Tell us about the YouTube page, and then we'll get going.
Okay, well, it is a podcast which a friend and I, Stephen Austin, started because apparently it's the destiny of all people on Earth to have a podcast. But I was officially talked into doing this, and what it is, it's a Steve and I used to get around and have a couple of beers and talk about things, and then we decided that maybe we should record these and see if anybody else is interested. So if you check out Strange as It Seems podcast on YouTube, I think you can also find it on Spotify and other platforms for download. You'll find episodes we've got an episode on Jack Parsons, who was a rocket scientist and a follower of Alistair Crowley, who we may get into later. There are episodes concerning everything from UFOs to lost civilizations to Tesla and his technology, assassinations, espionage. My interests tend to have run a somewhat wide gamut. But I would say that there's a new episode which is coming out on I think Friday. And we'll be discussing things like Tesla and Anton Mesmer and animal magnetism. Sort of an idea is used to how one could invent the future through technology. And also, last but not least, we'll also delve into the mysteries of the Cyberculture Research Institute in England in the 1990s. And the very interesting philosophies of Nick Land, if anybody knows who that is. If you don't, you should Google it to find out who he is. But yes, if you're interested in the strange and hopefully the informative, check out Strange as It Seems podcast on YouTube.
And you mentioned Mesmer. That's the guy that mesmerize, the term.
So, yeah, he usually gets connected. This is 18th century. This is sort of pre-revolutionary Paris, and he was a kind of Dr. Feelgood. He tended to treat people for often vague ailments. A large proportion of his client base was female, and his treatments involved manipulation of various body parts, so you can take that where you want to. Yes. But the interesting thing is that while he's generally connected to the idea of hypnotism, and he probably did use hypnotism to treat psychosomatic or real ailments, what got my attention is that another device he used in his therapies were basically, they're described as large earthenware jars full of wet soil with wires coming out of them, and that he attaches these wires to various parts on the body, the sort of afflicted areas. And to me, that sounds like a battery.
Yes.
And I think that's what he was doing. So in the 18th century, you had a guy who was making sort of crude wet cell batteries and using electricity. Well, a tingle was a new thing in the 1700s, but that Mesmer always argued that he wasn't an occultist, he wasn't an astrologer, he wasn't into the woo-woo stuff. He argued he was a scientist. And I think that's one little example that points in that direction, sort of.
This is this is just going off in a totally different direction, but I remember reading about, because, there's all of these books about ancient astronauts and ancient technology and et cetera, and I seem to recall reading that there had been discoveries of these, and it was exactly how you described it, an earthenware jar, and, people couldn't figure out, what even are these things that we've discovered? And some people believe that they're actually very primitive batteries. It actually sounds very similar to what you're describing that Mesmer came up with.
Well, the interesting question is that, I mean, in all likelihood, those things are not that difficult to put together. They're fairly simple ingredients that would be widely available. And the interesting question for me is, where did Mesmer, if indeed these were batteries, where did he get the idea? Because he did actually start out in his early career. He was a traveling astrologer and faith healer before he sort of hit the big time. So where did a traveling astrologer and faith healer in 18th century Germany come across the knowledge to put these things together, which would suggest to me that he didn't just invent this on his own, that he got the knowledge from somewhere else, but meant that someone else got it from someone else. And so who knows how long this has been around. See, one of the things we do, and I'll say this from the standpoint of a professional historian, and I've got the paper to prove it, is that we tend to underestimate people in the past. I mean, all too often we tend to think that people in the past were just stupid. Okay, that's why they lived that way. That's why they were camping all the time, because they were just stupid. And they weren't, or at least they're not any stupider than we are, because the organism really hasn't changed. People in the past didn't have more or less mental capabilities than we do. They were simply working with more raw material. So yeah, I think we underestimate people in the past, and we underestimate the past itself, and assuming that it is entirely backward and primitive. And we get away with underestimating it because when it'll boil it all down, we don't really know that much about it.
You know, I was looking through the podcast here, and you have this one here, Who Wrote the Protocols, which is fairly recent. Yeah. And this would be the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what book I read. It was a long time ago, but there was a whole chapter on the protocols. I knew nothing about them until I read this book, and basically it's and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is like historically one of the most horrific documents probably ever circulated, and like the entire thing. I mean, it seems like it resurfaces regularly. It's been a hoax from day one. I guess whatever the protocols are, I guess there had been a previous book that somebody eventually found that was like the basis for them. But, I mean, they influenced... What happened here? Tell everybody the story.
Well, let's start. What are the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion? They are basically, they purport to be the minutes of a meeting held by a group called the Learned Elders of Zion, which lays out the plan for what is described within this as a Masonic Jewish conspiracy. I think that point is important because it's usually said, oh, this is supposed to be a blueprint for the Jewish conspiracy to rule the world. But it's always a Jewish Masonic conspiracy, or in some versions more a Masonic Jewish conspiracy. But it's interesting that those two things are combined together. And one of the things that certainly did, the protocols first appeared in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. After World War I, they spread all around the world. They are not terribly long. They're not an entire book. They would probably constitute a pamphlet. And again, they generally have somewhere around 22 or 24 or 26 protocols or elements. A protocol in this case is the notes of a meeting. It's supposedly the written notes taken at a meeting. And, you know, they don't make sense on any particular level. Some people argue that, well, they're a masterful blueprint for how to rule the world. Well, they're a masterful blueprint to how to rule the world if you're a Bond villain. And then that's really the way they kind of read. You would have to, first of all, nobody takes notes that way. Also, I would think that if you actually had a secret organization to rule the world, you wouldn't write stuff down and then lose it, which apparently happened. But they're a kind of blah-ha-ha. You know, it's the typical stuff. How are you going to rule the world? Or are you going to subvert governments to get control of money, control education? I mean, all of those things seem fairly obvious because anybody who sought to do that would do the same type of thing.
All right, well, hold that thought, and we'll pick this up right after the break. Observer Live.
Right.
Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. Joined today by Richard B. Spence, and we were talking about these protocols before the break. Continue.
Well, the protocol, it's sometimes been called the most destructive and insidious document in history. That's saying a lot, but it is insidious and destructive. So let's put it this way. The strength of the protocols, the power of the protocols, doesn't actually rest in the logic of anything it has to say. It doesn't have to make sense. It rests in the very simple fact of propaganda or disinformation, of the way to influence people is to tell them what they already believe, to feed their ideas back to them, to confirm their prejudices, to confirm their belief in something. And essentially the Protocols was arguing that, Jews collectively are bad people who are plotting to rule the world, and if you were inclined to believe that, as people were, Hitler and the likes of Henry Ford were two examples, it simply confirmed what they believe. It gave them some kind of apparent, a phony documentary basis to believe that. So the baleful influence of the Protocols in history is abundant if you want to look at it. But what I find really interesting about it is where it came from, who wrote it. And there are various, if you watch that episode, we'll go through this, but there are various stories, mostly contradictory, that claim, it originated here with this person, it originated there with that person. And those stories are, each one of them, untrue. And many, the most popular one, which was put forward in a book called Warrant for Genocide in the 1960s by a very competent and serious author who was, went with the best story he had, but the best story he had was made up. It was a story which was made up for money, and it described a creation of the Protocols in Paris in 1904 that never happened. And here's the main reason why it never happened, because the Protocols had actually been published in their first form in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1903. So the problem is that you can't forge something in 1904 that's already been published in 1903. And what appeared in 1903 in an obscure Russian newspaper called Znamya. I mean, it's not a newspaper that not a lot of people read. It tended to appeal, let's say, to staunchly monarchist, anti-Semitic opinions. So most of the readership of that newspaper, as I was saying, already had a fairly bad view of Jews, and therefore any story that painted them in a negative light was popular for its readers. So again, it's confirming the prejudices of the audience. And that's a newspaper article. Again, it's not a book, but where did that article come from? Still can't determine who it was. And to keep a very long and complicated story short, the origins of the Protocols to me are mysterious and obscure, and I think lead back to France in the 1890s. And I think there are connections to things like the Dreyfus case and the Taxil hoax, and those are all things you'd have to Google to figure out what those were. But Paris in the 1890s was awash in all kinds of conspiracies and conspiracy theories, and I think the Protocols come out of that. Now, another little detail is that often the Protocols are said to have been they were a forgery based upon the plagiarism of an earlier book called A Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu.
Yes, I think that's what this book claimed. Right.
And there is a connection between the two. In fact, one of my theories is the same person actually wrote both of them, but you'd have to watch the episode to figure that out. But it was the dialogue, let's call it that, goes back to the mid-19th century. It originated decades earlier, and it was essentially an attack upon the then ruler of France, a fellow by the name of Napoleon III, not the real Napoleon, his near-to-well nephew. And it was a political attack. It actually, in structure, bears no resemblance to the Protocols. So the dialogue is not the minutes of a meeting. it's this one of these things that it's this literary device of taking two famous dead people and getting them to talk to each other in the afterlife and putting various ideas in their mouths. But whoever put together the protocol definitely had a copy of the dialogues, and what they do is they just kind of borrow from it willy-nilly. I mean, there are excerpts. It's not like they take whole sections of the protocols and then turn those into portions of the rest. They just sort of borrow selectively, as if they kind of had the dialogue at hand, and they were just, that's a nice sentence, or I like that phrase, or I like the way I say something here. And that's why I think the fellow who wrote the dialogue, who died in the 1870s, a fellow by the name of Maurice Joly, towards the end of his life, actually took his own book, Who Would Know It Better, and just kind of recycled it for the purpose of another political diatribe, which he never published in his lifetime, that someone got a hold of later and essentially turned into the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That, I would stress, is my theory, so it's not a fact, but that's the best bet I have at present as to where it came from. But there are lots of mysteries, and that's what attracts my attention. Is anything. Yeah, I like a puzzle. I like a mystery to solve, and the protocols are full of them.
You go back all the way to the mid-19th century when talking about this particular conspiracy theory, and I think that because of social media and podcasts and everything else, I think that, here in the 21st century, there's so many different conspiracy theories, and I think that some people believe that, this is maybe something new, or there's significantly more belief in conspiracy theories nowadays. I think it's just that's our belief living in this time and place. But conspiracy theories, I mean, these date back, I'm sure, to, the beginning of humanity. And it's been something that is just, however they're delivered, whether it's a pamphlet, whether it's somebody's podcast, whether it's Twitter. I mean, I think they've always been here. I don't think it's any more. I mean, what do you feel? Do you think it's escalated in recent years, or is it just, I guess, the medium by which they are distributed is so much wider that, more and more people are hearing about different conspiracies nowadays?
Well, the internet can take something that can be of completely trivial importance and turn it into the most important thing in the world in a very short period of time. I mean, look at things like memes. They're not terribly important, but they can somehow be spread almost like a virus. Here's the thing to keep in mind about conspiracy theories. Okay, conspiracy theories. A theory is basically an argument. It's a story you've come up with to try to explain something. You can't prove it. That's why it's a theory. But conspiracy theories exist because actual conspiracies exist. I mean, sometimes you can get the idea that if one person mentions the name, utters the word conspiracy, well, then it's automatically a conspiracy theory. No, history is full of an endless number of genuine conspiracies of one form or another. Remember, the Nazis were convicted of conspiracy to start aggressive war, which they did. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a conspiracy. Franz Ferdinand, the guy whose death started World War I, was most definitely assassinated by a conspiracy. John F. Kennedy, according to Congress, was probably killed as a result of a conspiracy. But that's still a thing of debate. But real conspiracies exist because people conspire, and they do it all the time. And that's the other thing that we're aware of. If you look, I mean, people have conspired against you and I in our lifetimes, in a minor sort of way. I'll give you a little example. Some people may recognize this. You and some friends are getting ready to go to a party or getting ready to do something, and you're wondering who to invite and the rest of it. And someone says, "Do we have to bring Bob?" Well, why not Bob? Well, Bob is kind of problematic at parties, and it would just be easier if we didn't tell him and didn't take him. So you all agree amongst yourselves that you're not going to tell Bob. Well, Bob may never know it, but you've all just engaged in a conspiracy against him. And this is the most important thing. How do you define a conspiracy? It is, in essence, two or more people, one can't do it, two or more people acting together in secret. That's the key part. They keep this secret from everyone else to attain a common goal. That's all it is. Two or more people working together secretly behind closed doors to attain some common goal. Now, when you keep that definition in mind, and
when you keep that definition in mind, that's basically my children last night when I was doing a show. They conspired to make tea when they knew they weren't supposed to.
Yes. So you see, conspiracy is just the way that humans interact with each other. So there's nothing weird or strange or unusual or aberrant about that behavior. People behave that way. People naturally conspire. One of the reasons is that, you've all been, I think...
Well, hold that thought. We'll come back to conspiracies after this commercial break, everybody, and then we'll talk about Alistair Crowley, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline, Broadcasting Network. Back in the show, Bryan Alvarez, After Dark Radio. Very happy today to be joined by Richard B. Spence. We'll be talking a lot of different topics, have talked a lot of different topics, and I was planning to start the show talking about Alistair Crowley, but we have a lot of different things we've been talking about here today. But I do want to ask about Crowley while we have time here, and hopefully we could do another show someday because we've barely even started here. But Alistair Crowley, I think we should at least start by telling, if anybody happens to be listening to this who does not know who Alistair Crowley is, let's do a quick bio, and then we'll talk about what you might not know about Alistair Crowley based on your book.
So, Alistair Crowley was born in 1875 in England into a relatively well-to-do family. In fact, a well-to-do, what we would call today, Christian fundamentalist family. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, he has grown up. His fame rests in probably being, he's usually termed politely the most important occultist of the 20th century, and people who really don't like him call him the most influential Satanist of the 20th century. In his lifetime, he was termed the wickedest man in the world and a man we'd like to hang by various people of the British press who clearly did not care for him. In terms of his influence on the modern occult, everything from Wicca to even all variety of occult secret societies, he is tremendously influential. And I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of his in the 1940s and 1950s, one of his devoted American followers was a fellow by the name of John Whiteside Parsons, or Jack Parsons, who was associated with Caltech, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and is really one of the pioneers of the American space program. So keep in mind, one of the guys who helped to put a man on the moon was also a follower of Alistair Crowley, who invoked demons in his spare time. So Crowley is, that's kind of my first test. I meet anybody and they go, oh, well, you know, I'm interested in magic or I'm interested in the cult. So my first question to them is oh, well, you're of course aware of Alistair Crowley. And if they're not, I put them in the poser bag very quickly. And if they do, I would like to see what it is that they have. Now, all that said, let me make something very clear. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a particular, I'm not a follower of Crowley. I'm not interested in him in that way. I do not perform his rituals in my spare time, or certainly not professionally. I'm not into that part of it. I am into studying it and studying him. And I think the main thing that perhaps Crowley has been misunderstood, and I think he has been, partly because he made himself misunderstood, is that he wasn't, is he maybe arguably the most influential occultist of the 20th century? Sure. Is he the most influential Satanist? Well, I'd say no, because that's not something, even in his rather eccentric belief system, he was not, nor did he ever claim to be, nor did he ever really act in that way. He's a guy who, some ways, kind of relished a bad boy reputation. You know, he actually took a certain thrill in being called the wickedest man in the world. Who wouldn't? But then he eventually learned something that once you get that kind of reputation, it sticks with you and you can't live it down, which I think was one of the great results of his life. I can bring up something else interesting about Alistair Crowley. His real name isn't Alistair Crowley. His real name, as far as I can tell, his only actual legal name his entire life was Edward Alexander Crowley, to his intimates, Eddie. And in fact, in my view of Crowley, I think there were always sort of two people there. There was, Alistair Crowley was a kind of, it was a persona. It was a kind of, think of it this way, it was a kind of stage name. It was a name of, in many ways, a kind of character that he played in life. But always next to that was Edward Crowley.
Yes, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the other show that I do is on professional wrestling. And so I think that most people listening to this right now know exactly what you're talking about in terms of a character and your actual real-life persona.
Yeah, and it's the type of thing that I'm sure there are wrestlers and there are undoubtedly actors who know this, that if you play a role long enough, the role will begin to play you.
Yes.
That it takes over who you are. And I think that basically is one of the things that happened to Crowley, and again, part because he helped that happen. He liked being the wickedest man in the world until that became a problem.
Yeah, we refer to them in wrestling as workers. You're a worker. There's your work persona, and not so much nowadays because the wrestling business is so much more open and everybody always knew what it was, but now wrestlers actually go on TV as their actual real life persona. But particularly guys in the 70s and the 80s and early 90s, I mean there were a lot of guys like that where it was termed living the gimmick. You basically became. I mean, Hulk Hogan, who just passed away, was a great example. I mean, any interview you had with Hogan, every story he told was like it was total BS. It was like he couldn't separate himself from this character that he played. And it sounds like you're explaining this same sort of deal with Crowley.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of negative fame that he actually acquired. Infamy as opposed to fame. And you also mentioned this thing about people making things up, and that's another. For some reason, in the research I do of the characters that I've written or done, biographical work on, where you actually try to go through and you start cyber stalking them in a way they're dead, but you start trying to look into someone's life, you'll find out, or at least for some reason I want to study pathological liars. I don't know why that is. Maybe they exist.
Study wrestling.
Yes, But people will, and that's another one of those things you always have to keep in mind, is that you're being lied to constantly. I know we don't like to think. I mean, in everyday dealings with people are generally truthful until they're not. There's a particular historical character that I and some other people have been digging into, a guy named Fred Chrisman. I will only say about him is that he both shows up in a UFO case and in the JFK assassination, that one person. But the thing about Fred Chrisman is that I describe him as a man who was always lying, except on those occasions when he was telling the truth. And that actually, the more you look at him, becomes shocking when you find out that he actually said something that was true. And now you have to think, well, I don't know, I dismissed everything else as being untrue because he lies all the time. So in that regard, I will say this in Alistair Crowley's favor. Of the historical figures that I have delved into to any significant degree, I would actually rank him as one of the more truthful. I would say that Crowley tends to tell the truth or something close to it most of the time. And that's actually one of the things that he had claimed to sort of defend himself, to claim that I'm not the sort of traitorous blackguard you think I am, is that I had actually served His Majesty's government as an intelligence agent in America during World War I. And I had seen that claim made by him, and I think by a lot of other people, I assumed it was just self-serving BS until I decided to actually go and look into some records and found out that, nope, it wasn't BS. That he actually was, and then that set off the whole idea to figure out exactly what he was doing in that role. But so that was something I think even people who were his friends, people who otherwise believed him, thought he was making up, turns out to be true. But see, that's what keeps history interesting.
So he was a spy.
Yes, he was. I think the best term for him, don't think of him as an intelligence officer, but as an intelligence asset.
Sure.
He could be used in certain. He knew the right people. Okay, everything in intelligence is about either protecting information or acquiring information, and one of the ways that you do both is through influence, or the influence of other people. And one of the things about Crowley's influence in, let's say, secret societies and occult orders, is that those things are actually, in popular imagination, we tend to think that the only people who belong to things are, belong to something like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Well, that just attracts weirdos, right? Well, no, or at least it attracts rather wealthy, influential weirdos. people who are involved in business and politics and the arts and elsewhere, the sort of occultosphere, those collection of organizations, esoteric orders, lodges, etc., connect people in ways that are not otherwise visible. So you may know what political party a person belongs to, you may know what business they work for, but what you probably don't see is what secret oath-bound orders they belong to, because those, again, are kept out of sight.
So Alistair was an occultist. This wasn't like a cover for what he was engaged in terms of British intelligence. He was an occultist.
Yes. Did he practice ritual magic? Yes, he did. I mean, it appears, here again, the little definition is in order. What are you talking about when you talk about the occult? The occult simply means hidden. And the idea is that there is a hidden world of beings and powers. There is the wider world around us, and certainly one of those does exist, because your dogs can hear things that you can't. There's a hidden world. How far does that world go? What Crowley called magic or occult techniques was a means of trying to access and manipulate that world for purposes in this world. And everything from the summoning of those beings, whether they were gods or demons or however you wanted to describe them, through the application of will. I think that Crowley, one of the most important things he ever said was his definition of magic. And it's interesting to think about. He described it, I'm going to paraphrase, but I'm going to get it pretty close. Magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. That is the application of willpower to create actual change, to bend reality. Now, that sounds kind of weird. Have you ever heard people talking today about manifesting things?
Yes.
You have to imagine. Well, that's what it is. Okay, that's what Crowley was talking about.
So why was it termed black? They always use the term like black, like there's magic and there's black magic. And is it forcing change through the power of will that is evil? Is that the difference?
It's all about intent. So everything in occult practice or in magic is about intent. It is black magic if its aim is essentially negative. If it's something which is to attain, and well, here's the example of it: to kill someone to gain from their death, to use some sort of spell or other kind of influence to cause someone's death so that you would profit from it. It doesn't get much blacker than that.
Yes.
Now, on the other hand, you could use those same kind of, if you wanted to create change, think of it this way: you want to create change in conformity with will. So you want something to happen. What do you want to happen? Do you want someone to die, or do you want them to be healed? It's the same application with a different intent. So black magic is negative intent. White magic is positive intent. And by the way, whether he was BSing us or not, Crowley, and I think he was sincere about it, my opinion would be, viewed himself as a white magician, or at least a gray one. Maybe he's kind of a Gandalf the Gray in that case, but not a black one. He actually saw himself as an opponent.
All right, well, hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment, everybody. After Dark Radio Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. Back in the show, Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio. Richard B. Spence is our guest, and hopefully we can get him back on again soon because I got 1,000 questions. But, Richard, we got to get into some plugs here. You got a book, you got the website, the YouTube podcast. Let's hear where we can hear more from you.
Well, if anything I've said sounds interesting and you'd like to hear more, or read more, on Crowley, I'll plug my book there. It's called Secret Agent 666, Alistair Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, available on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. I have other books on the spy Sidney Riley called Trust No One. You can find that one as well. Another one, more mundane topic, called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. But then the podcast, again, is where there's a variety of topics, is Strange as It Seems podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Podbean as well, I think. And that would give you the largest selection of my stuff, and there will be more. We'll add as time goes on.
That's right, and we only scratch the surface here because really any of these topics, I mean, who are the Illuminati? 2.5-hour podcast on that topic alone. So we gotta do more. But Richard, I want to thank you so much for doing the show today, and of course, thank you everybody for listening. We'll talk to you next time. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network.